We're here with Brody, and he would like to say a few things about why there is a museum devoted to biblical archaeology in Berkeley, of all places.
Well, we're here in the W.F. Bade Museum of Biblical Archaeology at Pacific School of Religion. And the reason why the museum is here is because of my predecessor, after whom the museum is named, William F. Bade. And he was a professor here at Pacific School of Religion from 1902 to 1936, and was professor of Old Testament and Semitic languages. And towards the later part of his career, he became more and more interested in archaeology, which at the time, so this would have been in the 1920s, was still a fairly young field. Actually, all over the world it was fairly young, but in terms of the area of whatever you want to call it, the Holy Land or Syria, Palestine, it was particularly new. And I think part of those interests also came from the fact that he was very much a naturalist here in California. He was very intimately tied into the Sierra Club, and was actually ended up becoming very close friends with John Muir, who you may know from such things as Muir Woods or from his writings. Muir was much his senior, and when Muir passed away, Bade actually became the literary executor for his estate. And so after a career in biblical studies and a later career in archaeology, William Bade is actually best known for his editing of a multi-volume John Muir set of writings. I believe it's somewhere between 8 to 12 volumes. And so that's what he's most famous for. But here at the museum, we really do appreciate his archaeological work. And that was inspired by actually an argument in the academic literature of the time. So this would have been back in the teens and early 20s. There was an American scholar and a German scholar who had two different locations figured out for the biblical city of Mizpah. And there are several Mizpahs in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible. But this is the one that's particular to the region of Benjamin, the tribal area of Benjamin, which is located north of Jerusalem. It's fairly small in size. And this settlement is known from biblical texts to have been fortified, for instance, by King Asa in the 9th century, one of the early kings of the kingdom of Judah. We know that the prophet Samuel prophesied at the site, but it's probably most famous for being tied in with the later prophet Jeremiah. And those stories involve, so Jeremiah is a prophet who was doing his thing in the 6th century. So this is the time of Babylonian power in the region. And for various political reasons, the Babylonians come back to Jerusalem and destroy the city in 586 or 587 BCE. And the prophet Jeremiah chooses to go to remain actually in the region of Judah and not join the exiles in Babylonia, and is essentially settled at the alternate site of Mizpah, which we believe was the regional capital of the Babylonian Empire in Judah. And part of this is because of the very practical reason that Jerusalem is actually destroyed by the Babylonians. So there was no city there, or the major parts of it were destroyed. And so, again, there was an argument as to which archaeological site could be equated with this biblically known settlement of Mizpah. So Bade decided with this argument to choose one of the two sites, and he chose an archaeological site called Tel en-Nasbeh to excavate with this biblically informed question in mind. And this was very typical of the time. Can such and such a site be equated with, archaeological site be equated with a known biblical settlement? And so between the dates of, let's see, 1926 to 1935, he carried out 5 major expeditions digging this site of Tel en-Nasbeh, which at the time was on the outskirts of the modern city of Ramallah. Now it's incorporated, it's surrounded by the city of Ramallah, which is located about 8 miles north of Jerusalem. And so in 5 seasons, he was able to dig about 2/3 of this 8-acre site. Something which today, by modern standards, is almost unheard of, but again was very typical for that time period. And I can tell you that after 5 seasons and with all that material that was uncovered, we still cannot definitively say that the site was the ancient settlement of Mizpah, but it's a very good fit. And in the end, I actually wrote a recent article that sort of split the baby. It was a very Solomonic kind of thing, because I believe that from archaeological evidence, that Tel en-Nasbeh was the Mizpah of the late Iron Age, the time of the divided monarchy, into the Babylonian and early Persian period. And then for reasons that we don't totally understand, the competing site, which is called Nebi Samuel, which is a little bit to the south and to the west, is actually the Mizpah of the Hellenistic period, which is mentioned in 2nd Maccabees. And so I think actually the answer is both and not either or. But getting back to Badè, so over those seasons, he uncovered obviously a lot of very rich finds, and a percentage of those finds, according to the law of the time, so this was the time of the British mandate in the region between the 2 world wars. So many of those finds came back here to Berkeley, but from my perspective as a researcher, the real treasure trove is that we also have all of the original documentation from the expedition. And so today, not just I, but many researchers actually from around the nation and around the globe can use this documentation and still study this material that was excavated in the 1920s and 30s, but in a modern way, doing it contextually and bringing meaning to these ancient artifacts. That's on the research side. On the museum side, we have displays here that tell 2 different stories primarily. One, the story of archaeology, because many lay people don't know the kinds of information that one can get from material culture or from archaeology. So that's one set of themes of displays. And then the other ones really tell the story of daily life in the late Iron Age, which is the time of the divided monarchies in biblical chronology, in a large village in the territory of Judah. What I find interesting, both as a researcher and as a museum director, is that oftentimes those aspects are the kinds of stories that are not revealed in biblical stories, or are underemphasized, or are not focused on probably because of the differentiation in classes. So our ancient historic material or written material typically was being both captured and focused on ancient elite people. You can think about the stories of kings and queens and royal families, or important characters, of course. That's many of the narratives in the Hebrew Bible are focused on important people. You think of Moses's and Sarah's and this sort of thing. But what archaeology can tell us, especially the archaeology of a village, is what daily life of common people was like. And of course, common people, villagers, really made up, the numbers vary, but somewhere between almost 90% to even 96% of this ancient society. And so I feel that the archaeology really can bring a kind of voice or tell stories that we don't have captured in our ancient texts, let alone our sacred texts. And so that's, for me, is part of the joy of directing this museum, being able to tell those stories.
Okay, we're on the Holy Hill, and we're surrounded by seminaries. How do you get seminarians interested in old pots?
That is a very good question. So as our collection is a legacy of the 20s and 30s, there are I would say, similar collections at several locations in the US because of the tradition back then of a kind of historical critical approach to learning biblical texts. That, of course, has fallen out of favor in most seminaries across the US, with more of a focus on sort of sociology aspects, other kinds of aspects, and less of a focus on biblical texts, I would say, in general, and especially on historical critical approaches to biblical texts. And so I'm still, so I've been here about almost 17 years, and I'm still finding ways to make the material meaningful to a more current audience, shall we say. And I think in many ways I try and sort of, because again, many of these objects sort of don't tell us specifically about the history, say, of the texts themselves, but they help inform the background to these texts. Again, I had focused before on these sort of aspects of daily life, and there are scholars who talk about it's sort of the world around the Bible that's enlivened by these kinds of objects. And so those are the kinds of stories that I think these are important to tell, and the ones that I share with my students. And then also, again, emphasizing that idea that really material culture or archaeology can help sort of tell us about the underprivileged, the underserved from these ancient societies. And I think especially for a Berkeley audience, but hopefully for a wider audience, this addresses questions really that are related actually to modern issues of social justice. You know, how, I mean, in modern American terms, how do the 99% get represented as opposed to the 1%? And I think that's also applicable for the ancient world and the biblical world. And so archaeology really helps to fill that gap.
So the Bible is discussing a particular ethno-linguistic religious group. What does material culture show about how these people in this area identified themselves?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I'm trying to think of a sort of short way to answer that. It's actually fairly rare, but we can, from the material culture, come to the conclusion that these people were Judean. I mean, there are all kinds of issues about trying to find either sort of nationality or questions about ethnicity in the material record. And I do understand its complexities. But I would say, because of some of the written material we have from the site that presents itself as Judean, in balance with an informed use of the biblical texts, we can learn more about that kind of identity. And then one of the things that I found interesting and have worked on from a research perspective from this collection, again, has to do with some of the things that aren't written about. So I've uncovered, so to speak, at least in the collection, in the museum archives and in our holdings, that there were trade relations with some of the neighboring peoples that are mentioned in biblical texts. For instance, the Ammonites, who lived to the east of ancient Judah in what is now modern-day Jordan, who are traditionally represented in terms of animosity or sort of lack of relations. But it seems to me, having found materials from Transjordan at this Judean site, that this is evidence that there were also peaceful interactions. Perhaps things, again, that the elite didn't want to write about or were less interested in, as well as other kinds of connections, for instance, with the Phoenicians in the coastal areas to the north and to the west. And so I think while there was a particular sort of Judean identity that we can show even from the material record, from the archaeological record, that there were much closer ties to some of these other peoples that are mentioned in biblical texts, the neighbors who were to the east, to the west, etc., that shows a much more kind of connected world than one might assume from reading some of our texts preserved in the Hebrew Bible.
So we are a very short walk away from the university. What kind of relationships does this institution have with UC Berkeley?
All right. We are, so the museum is housed at Pacific School of Religion, which is an independent seminary. And so by definition, they're, because of the separation of church and state here in the US, with UC Berkeley being a public institution, there certainly are no financial ties, but there are intellectual ties. We have use of the library materials down at Cal and vice versa. Students can cross-register, again, going either ways. And I'm actually, I have an affiliated position with the Near Eastern Studies Department at UC Berkeley and the program in Ancient History and Mediterranean Archaeology. So there are intellectual ties as well. Very early on, so back in Badè's time in the 20s and 30s, I would say those ties were even firmer. I can't remember the exact history, but I believe the seminary actually predates UC Berkeley, and so there are some indications that, at least through church ties at the time, that some of the early founders of UC were looking to Pacific School of Religion for advice, and they had ties and things like that. And also, I believe some of the early presidents of UC sat on the board of trustees and things like that. And so I would say of late, though, much more recently, we're just trying to rebuild some of those early connections through intellectual, and also we sponsor and have co-sponsored intellectual events like lectures and things like that, that have a co-sponsorship, for instance, with the Center for Jewish Studies at UC Berkeley or the Near Eastern Studies Department. And I think at the sort of, again, at the unofficial level, there are many more connections than distance.
So we've been talking about the past. What do you see the museum's role in the future? Are you excited about something in the future?
Well, that's not as such a stumper, but I think usually I'm so worried about just sort of keeping the lights on that I don't have, haven't given myself the freedom to dream. You know, so I had been explaining to you off camera before that, so I came here about 16 years ago, and the museum had lacked a director for 20 years prior to that. And so I've been trying with I would say, a very limited budget, trying to revitalize exhibits, establish outreach programs through lectures and openings and things like that. And just, I want to keep continuing to do that kind of fine work, because this is really, and one of the other things I've worked on is to emphasize the museum aspect as opposed to the collections that are in storage, although we do also care for those as well, as many museums do. But to use the museum as an avenue for public outreach. Now, I realize many of you may not be able to come to Berkeley, California, so we've also tried to provide resources through our website and through, we have a large project databasing our collection and making it available through the internet. So people can access it, again, remotely from a computer, from a desktop. And so making the kinds of rich resources that we have here open to the public, accessible both virtually and in person here, if you can make it to Berkeley.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.